I'd just like to first start off by saying the honour is all mine. I'm delighted to have been invited here and to come and give this lecture. As Rodrigo said, we have a long association between Cambridge and CEDIPLA. And in particular, I'd like to thank, obviously, Professor Mauricio Loureiro. I hope the pronunciation is correct. Please apologize. With my name, I also get mispronunciations. Here has been very kind to arrange all this for me, and also Professor Hugo Secata, who's the director of CEDIPLA, with which we have links. It's invidious to mention people, but I must mention Freddy Gonzala, who was the coordinator of CEDIPLA's postgraduate program, has also been very influential. Rodrigo Simos goes without saying. I shall not say anything about Rodrigo. He has been a great friend of the Centre and of the Cambridge University. And also to mention, not least, Gustavo Brito, who, as my PhD student, I'm delighted to see making a mark for himself in academia. So I will, without further ado, start on my lecture. The lecture is actually written as a paper, so any of you who wish to look at it in greater detail, it is available. It is on economics, but I will try and keep the main arguments fairly simple. And because economists seem to like talking forever, I will probably try and keep myself to no more than 60 minutes or so, which may mean that I glance over certain of the issues that are developed in the paper. So the talk I want to give is about the crisis in macroeconomics. And I'm going to argue that there is a crisis, and it has come directly to light because of events since 2007. And a corollary of that is a very simple question: has there been progress in macroeconomics? Do we know more about macroeconomic policy than we did 30 or 40 years ago? Now, if I ask this question to our physical scientists friends, they would say it makes no sense in the natural sciences. Just look around at all the developments in technology. Just look at the experiments from the Higgs boson at CERN. Of course there's been progress. But I don't think the argument is so clear in macroeconomics. For the first thing is, unlike the physical world, the modern economy is far more complex than it was in 1776 when Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations. And the other thing is, our views on how the economy works actually influence the way it does work. There is a feedback between the way we introduce regulations or deregulations, which luckily the physicists don't have. The way they view the world doesn't actually alter the way the world exists. So my question, I think, is not a rhetorical question. It is a question that we need to look at. So what I'm going to do in this very brief lecture is just start off looking at the way economics has developed since the 1920s very quickly, through to the Keynesian revolution, and then to what came to be the dominant paradigm, the dominant theory, which I call New Classical Economics. And so in the early days, really at the risk of oversimplification, we had in the 1920s what was called the classical school, and a typical proponent of that was Arthur Cecil Pigou. And economics was very simple in those days. He simply looked at theory of unemployment as if it was a very simple question of supply and demand. And if you had unemployment, it was just like the market for fish. The price was too high. The wage was too high. Cut the wage, unemployment would fall. Then, of course, we had the major crisis. We had the Great Depression. And it seemed clear that this was not due to real wages being too high. And this led to the development of Keynesian economics in 1936, John Maynard Keynes. And what he argued was that the earlier theories were mistaken. What you needed to look at was demand, purchasing power in the economy. If people were unemployed, it was because there was no demand for those goods. It was not due to labour demanding too high a real wage. And the implications from his work was that there's a danger if you just left the free market to itself, there was no economic mechanism which would lead to full employment being reasserting itself. There was a need for government intervention in these cases, especially government expenditure. And so what we now have is, in fact, that theory or that revolution was dissipated. And we have the rise of what we may call the new classical economics, which was very much the view of Arthur Pigou, but in a very much more sophisticated mathematical form. This really was associated with the work of Lucas and started, shall we say, in the mid-80s. And it was a revolution that the insights of Keynes were not only forgotten, but were described as wrong, simply wrong. And Lucas is on record as saying that the Keynesian revolution took economics up a blind alley for over 30 years. So there's no need, really, once we understand the model and we have undoubtedly more rigorous mathematical models and we have more rigorous econometric testing, but there's no need for government intervention. And Keynes' emphasis on the role of the government was profoundly mistaken. So the first thing we notice is there's not a linear progression in economics. We've almost come full circle. We've started off with the classicals of the 1920s. We've come to a very much more sophisticated and mathematical macroeconomics, but it essentially has the same implications that Cecil Pigou would have agreed with. Then we had a slight problem. We had the subprime crisis in 2007. And as I shall demonstrate in the course of the lecture, a number of serious and influential policymakers complained that modern macroeconomics was useless in understanding the crisis. And I use that word advisedly. It is not an exaggeration. And again, I shall substantiate this with some quotes later from these policymakers, who were themselves academic macroeconomists. So the question arises, why? What was it that modern macroeconomics misses and that we really ought to have taken notice of? Now, if you read a detective novel, it's not until the last chapter the villain is revealed. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to tell you what I see as the main problem, and it may come as a surprise. What has been lost is the distinction between the concept of risk and uncertainty. When you read the general theory, Keynes played a great deal of emphasis on this distinction. And again, later in the lecture, I will go into it in more detail. But subsequent to his work in this area, and noticeably Keynes was actually a mathematician to start with, and his treatise, when he applied for a King's Fellowship, was on probability theory. So he knew about risk and uncertainty. It got lost. It got lost almost immediately in the 1930s when his book, which is rather obscure, was turned into a very simple mathematical model by Sir John Hicks. Now, even though I've said there's been this sort of progression from Arthur Cecil and new classical economics through Keynesian economics, to the new classical economics, even if you look at post-war macroeconomics since 1950, there have been a large number of acrimonious debates. One can think of it between the Keynesians and the monetarists, and I'm not going to go into that, and you can think of it also between the neo-Keynesians and the new classical economists. But just to show you that the debate we're facing is not new, let me just give you a couple of quotes. One is from the distinguished American economist William Nordhaus, and in 1983 he said, American macroeconomists are in disarray, like a shell-shocked army, barraged by criticism because of poor forecasts, confused because of divided intellectual leadership. They are unsure of which way to retreat. Out of the ashes of defeat rises a new phalanx of competing theories, a ragtag collection of discarded ideas from the past, as well as unproved fancies for the future. And commenting on this, the Nobel Prize winner Robert Solow said he couldn't have been in more agreement. He said disarray is an understatement. Thoughtful people in other university departments look on in wonder. Professional disagreements exist in their field too, but as outsiders they are shocked at the alternative schools of thought in macroeconomics and how they describe each other as wrong from the ground up. They wonder what kind of subject economics is. So disputes about economics are not at the frontiers of research, but they are really about the very fundamental tenets of the subject. Now, this was in 1983, and then something remarkable happened in that the debate seemed to disappear. There was a rise of new classical economics, which really became the benchmark of macroeconomics. The neo-Keynesians were subsumed within the new classical economics, and it's sometimes called the new classical synthesis. And this lasted for 20 years. And reading the literature at the time, you would have thought every single macroeconomic policy or theory had been solved. Just to quote you a couple of quotes. One is from two economists writing in the Journal of Economic Perspectives in 2006, said, over the last 3 decades, macroeconomic theory and the practice of macroeconomics by economists has changed significantly for the better. Macroeconomics is now firmly grounded in the principles of economic theory. And another economist from one of the federal banks in the United States, a distinguished macroeconomist, said, how the world achieved consensus in monetary policy. So if you were reading this literature in 2007, you would think that there was really no dispute left in macroeconomics. And again, as I said, the implications of this modern macroeconomics was government policy had really no impact. Government deficits had no impact, something called technically the Ricardian equivalence theorem, which just simply said if governments spend more, everybody knows rationally that they're going to have to pay for it by taxes later, therefore they will save more, therefore there'll be no net expenditure. Crowding out. Government expenditure will merely crowd out private investment. Government expenditure by definition is more inefficient than private expenditure. So what came out of this was the way to deal with inflation was through interest rate policy only and independent central banks. A lot of the problems this theory ascribed to was the political trade cycle. Governments coming up for re-election spent like mad. This led to excessive demand and inflation. So in 1992, in the UK, the control of monetary policy was placed in the hands of what was called the Monetary Policy Committee, independent of governments. And it consisted of members of banks, the Bank of England, and independent members. And across the world we had these independent banking. I think in Brazil it was in 1999 that it became an independent bank. And with the benefit of hindsight, it looks as if it works. If we turn to the diagram, looking at inflation, inflation fell from the high rates in the 70s to about 2 or 3%. And for a long time, 10 or 15 years, inflation was low. This was variously prescribed to the independent banks. What we now know and what was ignored was the fact it may have been due to the intense pressure of cheap goods coming in from China and India and had nothing to do with monetary policy. But we had a view expressed by the British Chancellor of the Exchequer that this was the end of boom and bust. We were in for sustained growth until our grandchildren were old. Then it all went wrong. What happened was the subprime crisis, and this ushered in the worst recession since the Great Depression. In essence, the subprime crisis originated in America, and it originated in the housing sector. Now, I'll try, if I've got time, to explain this in more detail later, but it involved a change in the institutional way that mortgages were given in the United States. Previously, mortgages were given by what were called mutual societies, non-profit making societies. Their sole function was to give mortgages. They examined very carefully the income of the person they were giving and the mortgages were paid back to the society, who then used the deposits, and they took deposits from other people. That changed. With deregulation, commercial banks and financial banks came in and started to issue mortgages, and then they did something called securitization. Rather than the mortgage payments going back to the bank, they issued bonds, and the bonds were financed by the mortgage payments. And what actually happened was that so prolific was the amount of loans, and at the time it seemed very safe. If house price inflation is 20%, as it was in the United States in 1 year, and you give a mortgage, then very quickly the value of your loan in the mortgage is going to fall. Therefore the collateral is the house. Therefore it is as safe as houses. What happened, of course, was house prices suddenly fell. These bonds then became equivalent to junk bonds, and the banks took huge losses, leading to nationalisation of Northern Rock in the United Kingdom and the collapse of other banks. Now, that's what happened, but when we look at it, and you consider the statements I made only 1 year, quotations for 1 year, it seems, A, it was totally unexpected. Nobody saw it coming. There are exceptions, 1 or 2 people, but I won't go into that. But basically the big institutions, the IMF, had no idea. In 6 months before the crisis, they argued global economic risks have declined since 2006. Declined. The second surprise was how what is a relatively small financial instrument, compared with all the amount of financial undertakings given, could almost, or shall we say, did bring down the banking system. And the third, and this is really the crux of my lecture, was how the crisis showed that contemporary macroeconomic theory, economists floundering to a certain extent. Now, I've said this, so what is the evidence for it? Well, the first person I'm going to cite is Danny Blanchflower, Professor of Economics at Dartmouth, and he was a member of the UK Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee at the time of the crisis. This is a quote from a lecture he gave. As a monetary policy maker, I have found the cutting edge of current macroeconomic research totally inadequate in helping to resolve the problems we currently face. I'm far from alone in these views. So here you have a policymaker trying to determine UK macroeconomic policy, looking to contemporary macroeconomics and dismissing it. No less scathing is Wilhelm Beuter, who was Professor of Macroeconomics at Cambridge and now at the LSE, and he was a founding member of the Monetary Policy Committee. He was one of the first members. Quotation here. Indeed, the typical graduate macroeconomics and monetary economics training received at Anglo-American universities during the last 30 years or so may have set back by decades serious investigations of aggregate economic behavior and economic policy relevant understanding. It was privately and socially a costly waste of time and other resources. Such was the extent of the dissatisfaction with this, with modern macroeconomics, that I last year, well, no, not even last year, a few months ago, I went to a conference by the Bank of England and the Government Economic Service, and they felt it necessary to run this conference, which they called "What Post-Crisis Changes Does the Economics Discipline Need? Are Graduate Economists Fit for Purpose?" So what actually happened, is well known, is that in the immediate aftermath there was a complete reversal of policies, and Keynesian macroeconomic policies seemed to come back into their own, led actually by Gordon Brown, the Chancellor of the United Kingdom, and Obama. There was massive government expenditure pumped into the system. Amongst other things, interest rates were cut to 0.5%. And this seemed to have averted the crisis. But what has now happened, and which may be surprising, is we now returned to the economics of austerity. It's almost as if the Keynesian policies or Keynesian revolution had never occurred. And so you've got a huge debate amongst economists. And the thing that's quite noticeable is that this was not in arcane academic journals. What has really transformed the system is the blog and the internet. And if you look at what's being written, you can almost see again Solo's words, wrong from the ground up, coming into vogue. Just to give you two examples, two very famous examples, notably Paul Krugman, Nobel Prize winner in international trade and regional economics or new economics, has now a very prolific writer, and in 2009 said, "How did economists get it so wrong?" It's a searing indictment of the profession. It was replied by John Cochrane, who is a new classical economist, with a rather ad hominem rejoinder. It was rather personal, but he just simply said, "How did Paul Krugman get it so wrong?" So you can see that the debate is really getting quite acrimonious. And another case, Brad DeLong, another Keynesian economist from a major university, in one of his blogs said, "The scary thing is not," and he named some distinguished new classical economists, "it's not that they're wrong, people are wrong all the time. The scary thing is the level at which they are wrong. These are all freshmen, okay, sophomore mistakes." Not being an American, I had to go and check this up. It means first year or second year undergraduate mistakes. Yet 7 included 2 past, and a year ago I'd have said 3 future Nobel laureates in economics. So in a sense, you can see that there is a crisis. So what I want to do very quickly is just take you through the Keynesian revolution and then to come back to try and justify my argument as to why this distinction between risk and uncertainty is so crucial. So if we just turn to the first figure, you can teach a parrot to be an economist, so the joke goes. All you have to do is teach them, say, supply and demand, supply and demand. Here you have the supply and demand for labour. This is the standard textbook of the labour market, and you can see that unemployment is because real wages are too high. This is, as I said before, this was the Pigou's explanation. What's interesting, I don't think anybody is seriously arguing today that the depression we're in is due to real wages too high. I may be wrong, but I don't think that is the case. So all you need to do, according to this, is to cut real wages. Now, what Keynes said is that if you start to do that, what actually happens? And if we move on to the second diagram, and I apologize to you who aren't economists, I will go through this fairly quickly, and it's not central to my argument, but it helps understand it. The real wage. Real wages at A. Pigou says, cut the real wage. You move to C and you move to full employment. What Keynes in fact was saying is you cut the real wage, what will be the first thing that happens? Demand will fall. As one economist said, if I made unemployment, what's the first thing I do? I stop buying champagne. Well, I don't actually buy champagne anyway, but I stop buying beer. So what do firms find? They find their inventories going up. They can't sell their goods. So what happens? They lay off labour. What does that do in this model? The demand for labour shifts backwards. It falls. Now the big distinction between Pigou and this is market for fish. If the price of fish falls, the income of fishermen goes down, but it will have very little effect on the demand for fish, which comes from most of the population. If the real wage falls, it has a major impact on demand. So what this diagram simply says is that for expositional purposes, the real wage can fall to the Pigouvian market clearing wage, but you've still got substantial unemployment, and it has made unemployment worse. So what's the rejoinder to this? Well, it could be that as the real wage falls, you're releasing resources, interest rate will go down, investment will go up, and will generate demand to compensate. This is where the distinction between risk and uncertainty comes in, which has been lost. So what is the distinction? And why is it important? It's sometimes called 90 in risk and 90 uncertainty because at about this time in the 1920s, Knight was making exactly the same distinction. And their views were both, Keynes's views and Knight's views were very similar. There was only one unfortunate thing was they couldn't stand each other. And when Keynes was invited to the United States, to the department where Knight was, Knight actually walked out of a lecture where Keynes was. Keynes actually did not suffer from false modesty, shall we put it that way. What is risk? Risk is something that can be expressed in probability equivalents. Such as if you're gambling, you can work out that the probability of throwing a 7 with 2 dice is 0.16666. I hope I got that right, but anyway, if somebody tells me it's wrong, please keep quiet. So if you throw a dice 10 times, you may find you get a 7 once, or it may be 3 times. If you throw it 100 times, you're going to have a very, very good idea. It's going to be very, very close to it. The probability will converge very rapidly to 0.166. So you have a very good idea of what the probability is, and of course this is what gamblers will take into account when they gamble. Statistically, we have a process that's known as ergodic. This is an ergodic process. Now the advantage of risk is if you know risk, you can hedge against it. You can take it into account. If you know what risk is and you're going to undertake an investment, you can factor it into what expected rate of return you're going to get, and you can be pretty confident whether your decision is going to be sensible or not. Uncertainty is something that's quite a different matter. Let me just quote you what Keynes said uncertainty was. Uncertainty, the sense in which I'm using the term, and he wrote this in 1937, is that in which the prospect of a European war is uncertain. Well, perhaps in 1937 it wasn't all that uncertain, but anyway. Or the price of copper, or the rate of interest years hence, or the obsolescence of a new invention, or the position of private wealth holders in a social system in 1970. All these matters, there are no scientific basis on which to form any calculability probability whatsoever. And as I said, this distinction came in 1902 when he was writing his thesis on probability. So just to give you a very informal illustration of the distinction, supposing you're unfortunate enough to enter a dice game with an unscrupulous opponent, and he has 7 weighted dice, and each time he throws it, or you throw it, he substitutes one of the true dice for the weighted dice. And you don't know what this weighted dice is. Even after 1,000 throws, you will not know the probability of getting a 7 with 2 dice. The process is non-ergodic. In fact, non-ergodicity is even more serious than that, because at least you know throwing 2 dice, the figure will be between 2 and 12. With a non-ergodic process, you don't even know what the bounds are. So the problem is that implications are far-reaching, and they have an immediate impact in 2 areas. One is in the real economy, which perhaps is not so serious, and the other is in the financial sector. And it's in the financial sector that the subprime crisis arose, and it is because of the failure of this distinction. So before turning to the financial sector, let's consider that you're an entrepreneur deciding whether you're going to invest. Now, technically, the investment's going to be whether, as economists say, the discounted stream of future net earnings exceeds its cost. In other words, if the revenues you're going to get from the machine exceed its costs, and the net present value, the value of your revenues, depends upon the interest rates. So economists are very fond of having a simple relationship between the rate of uncertainty and the rate of interest. So let's just have a look at this. If the rate of interest is high, then of course the cost of your machine is high, therefore your investment will be quite low. But as the Bank of England cuts interest rates, so it becomes more profitable to invest. So with a nice stable relationship, your investment will increase. So this is in fact the argument at the moment of cutting interest rates. Cut interest rates to 0.5. Real interest rates are minus 3%, shall we say? And a lot of people don't realise that it is costing them 3% to lend money to the banks. There should be a recovery. But what happens? You're an entrepreneur. Interest rates have fallen, but what you want to know is, at the end of the day, are you going to sell your goods? What is the probability of the machine that's producing goods, or needn't be machines, it could be taking on another worker, you're going to actually sell them? You can't have a probability distribution of that. This is where uncertainty comes in. And Keynes said, in the face of uncertainty, and we're in very uncertain circumstances now, what are you going to do? You're going to stay liquid. If you invest in a machine and you don't sell, you've taken a huge capital loss. If you don't invest in a machine and you put it in the bank, your loss is only minus 3%. So the effect of that on our schedule is that it's very unstable. It starts to shift down. And the way I've drawn it is, even though the interest rate has fallen, investment is falling because of the impact of uncertainty. Now the great problem is you have lots of dynamic general stochastic equilibrium models and you have lots of forecasting models. What's very difficult to model is the state of expectations. And that's why models go completely wrong, because you build your relationship from past data. When times may be far less uncertain and you get a relationship, then you find your relationship breaking down. Which is why it's come to some economists' surprise, but not all, that with interest rates are negative, investment is still incredibly low. Keynes called this animal spirits. And for a long time, I didn't quite know what that phrase meant. I thought, are baboons more uncertain than we are? Actually, it's from the Greek, animus, meaning mind. And it's, if you like, it's a state of expectations. And what he argues is that animal spirits are very, very volatile. In other words, animal spirits reflect your degree of uncertainty. Now, I might give the impression that I'm the only person making the distinction. That's not true. The Nobel Prize winner George Akerlof, writing with Robert Schiller in 2009, has a very good book on it called Animal Spirits. And they've actually analysed the way that changes in animal spirits can affect the functioning of the economy and cause depressions in a very accessible way. It's, unlike many economics articles, it's actually very readable. But as I said, the great problem with this animal spirits, or uncertainty, is it plays havoc with your econometric models. I want to digress just a little bit, because as we plunge into recession, to return to all the implications of the new classical economics. And one of their tenets, which I find extraordinary, is there can be no such thing as involuntary employment. Any unemployment is voluntary. And let me just quote you from Lucas. Nevertheless, the unemployed worker can at any time always find some job at once, and a firm can always fill a vacancy instantaneously. That neither does so is by choice, and it's not difficult to understand given the quality of jobs and employees that are easy to find. In other words, the argument is, if you're thrown out of work tomorrow, which I hope, given the strike, you're not, you could actually find a job somewhere. The fact that you don't take it is a matter of choice. So that anything we look at, unemployment is a voluntary. A Keynesian would say that commits the classic fallacy of composition. If, shall we say, I take as an example, Rodrigo has to go out and find a job, he could probably find one. If everyone in the university was sacked, you might suddenly find it difficult for everyone to find a job of any sort. We're now finding in the United Kingdom every job that's advertised is attracting over 150 people. And if I go back to the photograph, go back to the soup kitchen photograph, this one there. I suppose if you're a new classical economist, these people queuing on the door for free soup are merely taking leisure because they expect the real wage to be higher in the next time period, and they're utility optimizing. Well, I think my prejudices in this area are well known, so I won't go on to that. But if you believe that, shall we say you may believe anything. Anyway, let me go back to the main theme of my talk, and what went wrong. And this is the argument that the world or the macroeconomy is not ergodic. And that's what causes all the problems. I've suggested that it has an impact on the real economy because it affects investment decisions. The major problem comes when we look at the financial markets. So how does it fit into the story? Well, Keynes' distinction between uncertainty and risk is just applicable, if not more so, to the financial markets. And if you read the general theory, his examples are the stock exchange. It's not the real side of the economy. In fact, he calls the stock exchange the casino economy, the gambling economy. And what he argued was that when you start looking at financial markets, the decision to invest, etc., or professional investment, let me quote me, this may be somewhat sexist these days, but remember who writing in 1936, he said, professional investment might be likened to those newspaper competitions in which the competitors have to pick out the 6 prettiest faces from 100 photographs. It is not the case of choosing those which, in the best of one's judgment, are really the prettiest, nor even of which average opinion generally thinks the prettiest. What you need to do is you have to guess what the average thinks the prettiest, therefore you've got to guess what other people think the average is, and they've got to guess what other people think the average is. And he goes on to say that some people will go on to the 4th, 5th or higher degrees. In other words, you're not backing your own judgment, you're backing what other people are thinking. And this is true when you pick stocks. It's not really whether you think the stock is under or overvalued, it's whether you think other people think the stock is overvalued or undervalued. Now, the problem is, in an uncertain world, how do you make your decision? And Keynes said at this time, you dispense with your own judgment. You don't rely on your own judgment. You rely on what other people are saying. And the classic outcome of this is herd behavior. And this is what leads to booms, speculative booms and collapses in stock markets. You see shares rising. That must be because other people think they are good. You plough in with your money, they rise further. You think you're onto a good thing, until suddenly, for some reason, and it may be just a small trigger, the expectations go the other way and it collapses. Now, of course this was well known, and in the past we've had lots of speculative bubbles and collapses. Fascinating book written by Rogoff called This Time is Different, lists hundreds going back over the last century. But the major thing of past bubbles was they had very little impact on the real economy. Made a minor impact. Even the dot-com bubble, which was a huge speculative bubble, didn't have any impact on the real economy. But that is not the case today. And the major difference, of course, is the collapse of speculative bubbles did not affect the banking system or the financial system. So in spite of the fact we have all these bubbles, by the late 1990s, with the dominance of the new classical economists, There was confidence in the view, what was called the efficient markets hypothesis, that markets driven by traders maximising their profits would lead to an efficient allocation of resources. Again, it won't come as any surprise that underlying this is the assumption that the world is an ergodic process, not a non-ergodic. That you can have fairly confident ideas about probability distributions of outcomes. And again, I'll come on to deal with that. So you had progressive deregulation. Also, a major stepping point was the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act of 1933 by the Clinton administration in 1999. Glass-Steagall Act, because of the Great Depression, when many banks had gone bankrupt, made it illegal for speculative investment banks to also be commercial banks that are in the high street. So in fact, the commercial banks, if you like, those that took your savings, etc., were completely distinct legally and formally from investment banks that engaged in, shall we say, speculative activity. 1999, that distinction went. Therefore, major banks also became major investment banks. So let me just take an example. Barclays Bank, which is one of the biggest banks in the United Kingdom, has as part of it Barclays Capital Investment Bank that deals with its speculative side. Now, you would have thought that there may have been some concern about this, but Alan Greenspan, chairman of the Fed, in a speech 2005 to the National Association of Business, simply said, these increasing flexible, efficient, and hence resilient financial system, the one that occurred more than a quarter of a century ago, are responsible for the profitability and the dynamism of the United States economy. This was in 2005. Now, were there warnings? Yes, there was one major warning that went completely ignored. The United States. It nearly brought down the financial system of the United States, and it would have had serious knock-on effects in most of the other financial. And it happened in 1997. And it was the collapse of a small hedge fund called Long-Term Capital Management. Now, the irony of this was that the principals in long-term capital management were Myron Scholes and Robert Merton, who shared the Nobel Prize in Economics in 1997 for their work on financial markets. What did long-term capital management do? It started off as a very, very small fund, and it believed in efficient markets. So it believed that bond prices, international bond prices, would eventually converge. They must converge as regulations disappeared or irregularities disappeared. So what they did was, in a complex story, make it very short, they hedged, so it didn't matter whether these bond prices went up or down, they would make fortunes if the bond prices converge. Now, there are very, very small differences in bond prices, you can imagine. So what did they do? They leveraged. They borrowed. So their equity base was actually very small compared to what they borrowed to put into these trades. And although they started off very small, by about 4 or 5 years, they were one of the largest hedge funds in the United Kingdom. And the way they did it was through, I hope it's not a derogatory term, is the quants. A quant is a physicist or engineer well-versed in complex algorithms, and they used a lot of statistical analysis on past 10 years' data to make the predictions of which would actually converge. And of course, the whole of the distributions they were Gaussian, which means risk. They were arguing that looking at past data was, unlike all the warnings, a good predictor of the future. What happened? Well, what happened was something that's sometimes called a black swan. An extreme event occurred, and at the time it was the Asian financial crisis, followed very closely by the Russian devaluation. What that did was it meant that investors fled to quality and bond prices widened. So if we move on, this just shows you how long-term capital management was originally very, very profitable. It's the yellow line. And then what happened to its stock? It plummeted. Now, because it was based on ergodicity, or the Gaussian distribution, if you look at the brochures, they give very, very precise probabilities of their losses and possible gains. The fact that they would lose 90% of the value in 2 months, they didn't actually predict, but if you use their formula, it will occur once in several universes. Not once in this universe, not once in 2 universes, several universes. In other words, it was so extreme, just ignored it. So what happened? Well, of course, as I said, at the time, may not be quite so widely known, because of the inconveniences with the other banking systems, it nearly brought down the bank. So what was the intervention? The Fed intervened, but for political purposes there was no direct intervention. There was the major chairmen and CEOs of the banks to which long-term capital management were indebted, and other banks were called to a crisis meeting. And they were virtually locked in the room and said, until you agree to take on the deficits and the assets of long-term capital management, we're not going to let you out. I exaggerate a little bit, but there was a huge amount of arm twisting by the federal bank. And the outcome was, although long-term management was then technically rescued, the banking crisis that could have occurred passed. This had 2 adverse effects. First side effect was moral hazard. Bankers now realized that no matter how serious the crisis, the government was set in to rescue it. So that leads to risky behavior, especially if your bonuses are asymmetric. You get a bonus for how well you've done, taking speculative risks. You don't lose the bonus if you don't do very well. You may lose your job, but you don't lose a bonus. So one would have thought in 1997 these were warnings. The warning bells were there. Deregulation would come to an end, surely. There should be greater monitoring of these institutions. And one of my heroes of the time is a woman called Brooksley Bourne, who people call feisty and other people call difficult. She was an outstanding lawyer. I think she was the first woman to edit the Harvard Law Journal. And she was the head of an independent organization called the Commodities Futures Trading Commission. Very small, and it was set up originally to look at derivatives in the agricultural, such as pork, etc. The advantage of this thing was that it was independent, statutory. The Fed had no control over it, neither the government. She was so concerned about this, if you read what she said, she had sleepless nights about this unregulated derivative markets. So the Commission proposed to introduce severe regulation. Now the first thing that happened was Greenspan and Summers descended on her market and said, this would damage the United States economy incredibly, you are not to do it. And being independent, she said, I forget what the words would be, but would you kindly leave the room. So what actually happened was that in an obscure agricultural bill, it was passed into legislation that this commission could not interfere in the regulation of the derivatives. It was sort of slipped in. It was not a major debate, it was slipped in. And as a result of that, Brooksley Bourne's regulation, proposed regulation, didn't come to pass, and she resigned shortly after. What's quite interesting is that she was part of I think, US Congress, or one of the commissions, that was actually interviewing Alan Greenspan after the subprime crisis, and she had a few choice words to say about Alan Greenspan, which is on, I think, YouTube. She wasn't very complimentary. So anyway, at this time then, there was no further regulation because of a long-term capital management problem. In fact, I have a quote here from Greenspan, before the US House of Representatives, which was actually had a commission into long-term capital management. This is what he said. It is a rare, exceptional, and increasingly sophisticated pricing system, which is one of the reasons why the use of capital in this country is so efficient. It is why productivity is the highest in the world. This is the financial sector. Why our standards of living is without question booming. I am not saying that the cause of this great prosperity is the consequence of hedge funds, of which long-term capital management is one. What I'm saying is there is an economic value here which we should not merely dismiss. So as I said, after intense lobbying, the Commodities Futures Modernisation Act was passed in 2001, which blocked any further regulation of Brooks Bourne Commission. And since then, you saw the subsequent development of progressively new and more complex financial instruments, one of which was going to cause the meltdown in 2007. And this was the securitization of the subprime mortgages. It's a slightly complex topic. It's full of what somebody called alphabetical soup or something, full of CDOs, RMSs, lots of acronyms. But what I want to do is just simply, in very elementary terms, explain what was going on, and then to say why, again, the difference between uncertainty and risk came in. So as I said, for a long time, if you wanted to buy a house in the UK, you went to a building society. After the Big Bang, as it was called by Thatcher, these institutions stopped being non-profit but became commercial banks. And they essentially changed the way they dealt with mortgages. Previously, because you break the golden rule of lending long and borrowing short, they did what was called due diligence. As I said, you were called into the bank manager who would look very carefully at your assets, etc. I had personal experience of this when I was a postgraduate. My wife was earning, she was a nurse, we wanted to get a mortgage, so we went to the building society, said, "Can we have a mortgage?" They took one look and said, "No." I said, "Why not?" My wife's earning. She said, "Well, she might get pregnant, therefore you have no income, therefore we won't give you a mortgage." So you couldn't get a mortgage on your wife's earnings at that time. But throughout most of the post-war period, there's been a rapid increase in house price inflation, both in the United States and the United Kingdom. So as I said, if you buy a house, it's probably the best investment you can make, because the proportion of the house value that your mortgage is progressively diminishes just as a matter of time. It also means that it provides good collateral for other loans. So with progressive deregulation, not only were loans to houses given more freely, but of course you could use the value of your house to remortgage and to buy that yacht that you wanted, or in my case, that extra pint of beer. So there was a major change in the financial institutions. And the other thing was this thing that the subprime crisis was this thing that was called securitization. And as I said, instead of me borrowing from the bank and then paying it back, the bank would issue a loan, a bond, on the basis of my earnings, which you would then sell on. So the risk of the mortgage no longer rested with the bank. And what was more complicated than this, because you could take these bonds and subdivide them, and you could pay higher risks on those which bore the probability of default first. So if households were going to default, you'd have a number of bonds. The one that had the highest risk would be the one that bore the first default. So in other words, it was seen as a great advantage because people have different attitudes to risk. You could buy bonds with different risks, the securitization. And this came to be known as collateralized debt obligations. Now, it's sometimes thought that the only thing that was securitized was household mortgages. But if you actually look at it, virtually anything that generates a stream of earnings has been securitized, including parking fines, including rockstar royalties, including, in some cases, undergraduate fees. You name it, it can be securitized. But anyway, they were very popular because those that were supposed to be the less risky, almost risk-free, were earning about 50 basis points above US gilts. And at a time of very low rates of return, public institutions saw these as a way of enhancing their earnings far more than just buying treasuries. So, as I said, the banks didn't do due diligence anymore. They were passing the risk on. So how were the CDOs, etc., how were they, the risk, in inverted commas, assessed? It was passed on to the credit rating agencies. There were three major ones, Moody's, Standard & Poor's, and Fitch. And so they had all these bonds. How did they rate them? What they did was they used complicated and sophisticated computer algorithms that relied implicitly on ergodicity, which sounds familiar. The problem went a little bit more serious than this. First of all, that these credit rating income of household mortgages or CDOs reached 60% of their income, whereas rating corporate bonds issued by a firm, was only 1%. So the rating agencies were developing huge amounts of income from rating the CDOs. The second thing is, who paid for the CDOs? Well, it was the issuer. And who paid for the rating agencies? It was the issuer. So not only did the rating agencies rate the bonds, but they also gave advice on how to divide the tranches up to make the bonds look more attractive. But the problem is, of course, the way they rated them was tended to be fairly sensitive to the exact assumptions you put into your model. And what happened, in a sense, was that the whole of the credit rating was based on the assumption that house prices would rise. An insider at Fitch was asked what would happen if there was a decline in house prices on your ratings. They said our models can't cope with that because we have not built that in because it's so unlikely. With the downturn on the housing markets, what then happened was the reliability of these CDOs, or their risk, or the risk attached to it, became so uncertain that they became equivalently junk bonds because nobody knew, wrapped in these CDOs, how much were really worth assets and how much were worthless assets. And then something else that happened, which was called mark-to-marketing, is that banks relied on what the market valued these things as for counting as part of their reserves. The market froze and collapsed. For example, 27 of the 30 tranches of CDOs underwritten by Merrill Lynch in 2007, 27 of the 30 saw their AAA rating go to junk bond status virtually overnight. So the consequences are well known. The caps of the US housing market, the default rate on subprimes rose. The current market of CDOs became so uncertain and the level of risk associated with them became so, couldn't be determined, so the whole market froze. They couldn't be sold at any price. So because of lack of knowledge of the true risk underlying them, because they're uncertain, they became unsellable. And so the crisis elicited a mixed response from the authorities. Lehman Brothers was forced into bankruptcy. AIG was bailed out by the government. CDOs, or these things that were held by the banks, what they did, they had a little trick. They put them off the balance sheet, which meant they didn't actually occur in their asset balance sheets. So the fact that they went to zero at first didn't seem to matter, but then they were forced to bring them onto their balance sheets. With no market maker, there was actually no well-organized market and there was no orderly resale. So as a result, the banks collapsed. In fact, their capital base collapsed. And the knock-on effect included, as I said, Northern Rock, which was a major bank in the United Kingdom, which started off as a very small building society. But what it did, it didn't hold toxic assets. What had he done? It had a very aggressive lending policy of mortgages. It borrowed short on the international financial markets to finance the mortgages. What happened was the international finance markets froze. It couldn't roll over or get its it could not roll over. It had an acute liquidity crisis, and then the first time in, I don't know, 150 years, you had a bank run. You had literally people standing outside Northern Rock in queues to withdraw their money. Their internet banking system virtually froze because people were trying to transfer money out. So the banks in this situation cut back on all lending, and most noticeably they cut back on private lending to profit-worthy firms. It was very difficult to get any form of credit in the private sector, which Keynes would have predicted. You've got a major liquidity crisis. So that led to the recession, the 2007-2008 recession, which is, as I said before, this is what the Monetary Policy Committee had to deal with. And of course, looking at models, very interesting, dynamic general stochastic equilibrium models, the model of banking, didn't have a banking sector in it, and it didn't have any role for going bankrupt. And this is why they tended to find it was not a particularly useful model. So we find that bank rate was cut to 0.5, and good Keynesians would say because of uncertainty in the investment schedule, it's no wonder. That has very little impact on private investment. Quantitative easing, pumping money into the government, buying up corporate debt, government debt, to try and drive down long-term interest rates. This is the only prediction I did get right a couple of years ago. I said that would have no effect, and it hasn't had any major effect, even though billions have been pumped in through government quantitative easing. In other words, to try and convince people who are in a world of uncertainty is very difficult. You're not going to get very much expenditure. Just a couple of quotes before I conclude. I mentioned before, one insider in the credit rating industry asked why the rating agencies did not build in some cushion for possible fall in house prices, stated, if they had done so, they would never have been able to rate a single mortgage-backed CTO. In other words, they would never have been able to give it any value other than junk status. Another one said, what would happen if house prices fell? Well, they said that their algorithms assume that house prices would continue to rise indefinitely. Asked what would happen if house prices fell by 1 or 2% for any extended period of time, this is Fitch, replied their models would break down completely. So the obvious question is, given the fragility of the algorithms, and they were well known, I mean, the people who actually devised them knew their limits. Why wasn't the structured finance sector regulated? And that's not a rhetorical question, and I'm not sure I know the answer. Except there was an underlying, if you like, underlying argument from neoclassical economics that deregulated markets were the most efficient. Brooks and Burns tells a story of Alan Greenspan. Whether it's true or not, I don't know. Alan Greenspan said there was no need to regulate for fraud in the financial sector. Why not? Because fraud wouldn't occur. Why wouldn't it occur? If somebody acted fraudulently, they wouldn't have any further customers. End of story. He actually denies that, but anyway. So what we have had now, as we move into the recession, was that in fact the Bank of England resorted to trying to persuade the banking sector to lend more, literally. And as I said, the immediate response was Keynesian expansionary policy. In other words, if the private sector is not spending, then the government that doesn't have the problem of uncertainty should step in. And that actually occurred. But I think the worrying thing is that the old idea that balanced budgets are necessary in the classical view has sort of come back. That it is now, if you look at what is happening in Europe and in the United Kingdom, we've got the old classical, what we used to be called the treasury view. the economics of austerity. The only way to promote growth is to cut public expenditure, bring down interest rates, stimulate private expenditure. So once again, we've come back full circle, and Keynes is being ignored. So what were the conclusions to be drawn from this? Certainly after the subprime crisis, we've had a lot of post-mortems, we've had a lot of debates, and we've had a lot of inquiries into it. An early inquiry into the British banking system problems was by Lord Turner, and it was called the Turner Review, and it reported in 2009. It wasn't a very technical review, it was a policy-oriented review taking a lot of advice and evidence from bankers and some academics. And the most interesting report is its fundamental theoretical issues. There's a section on it, and it raises serious criticisms of the efficient markets hypothesis, on which the whole regulatory framework of the US and the UK banking system was based. It noticed that efficient markets can be irrational. It cites the work of Mandelbrot, Taleb, Soros, and the behavioral economists Kahneman and Schiller, all who are not mainstream economists, but all who actually have examined the way people act under uncertainty. It concludes, albeit with a brief discussion, that there was misplaced reliance on sophisticated maths, including short observation periods, in other words 10 years, non-normal distributions, systematic versus idiosyncratic risk, non-independence of future events, distinguishing risk from uncertainty. In other words, the banking system had based on the assumption that one could model uncertainty by risk, and the Turner Commission came to the conclusion it could not. So what I've said is that writing on the wall had been there from at least 1998. But it couldn't be read through the lens of the efficient markets hypothesis, and this dominated the thinking of a very few influential policymakers in the United States, United Kingdom. What comes out very noticeably is the powerful effect of the lobbying of the financial sector on the political infrastructure. In the United States, you can see it through contributions to campaign funds. You can see it through the social networks of bankers and Congress. In the United Kingdom, it has suddenly come to light through what started off as a very trivial case of phone hacking. And that has now exploded, showing the linkages, personal linkages between, not necessarily bankers in this case, but one or two prominent media moguls. Again, my reading of this, and this may be controversial, as much of the blame must rest with modern macroeconomic theory. One thing you happen to look at, if you look at the tripos in University of Cambridge, you look at money and banking, there is absolutely nothing about institutional factors of the banking system. It is all theoretical models dealing with utility maximizing people in the given constraints of risk. And the thrust was, time and time again, it gave the impression that the unfettered financial markets were the most efficient. Even to the extent that Gordon Brown, as Chancellor of the Exchequer, actually argued whether it wasn't a question of light regulation, whether we needed any regulation at all, and this was only 5 or 6 years ago. So buried in the complex mathematical models were axioms that actually led to the conclusion that financial markets were efficient. And I find it rather strange that for a paradigm that stresses the need to build a macroeconomic theory based on micro foundations, with the optimizing individual actor at its core, it's remarkable how little attempt has been made to actually analyze in a behavioral context how these actors actually work. How do people, and remember, we're not dealing with millions of people, we're dealing with a small number of people in the financial sector. How do they react when faced with trading losses, uncertainty, etc.? It has led to a branch of economics called behavioral finance. It's also one of the reasons, I think, why Daniel Kahneman got the Nobel Prize for behavioral economics. He is actually a psychologist, not an economist. And he's produced some very interesting work. But I think it doesn't need the benefit of hindsight to realize that what are called agents, or people, attempt to maximise their own bonuses by using other people's savings may not lead to socially optimal outcomes, especially when it's asymmetric. You get a bonus, as I said before, if you're successful. You don't lose it if you're not successful. And I think that the fact that many bankers largely correctly believed that large banks were too big to fail and were subject to moral hazard was also a major factor in the banking crisis. What I have omitted is corporate fraud. And I think what is now coming to light in the crisis is not only it was failure of regulation, etc., but there was a great deal of corporate fraud. The most recent is the libel scandal with Barclays Bank. Whether this was for individual gain, it certainly was bordering on criminal activity, but don't quote me on that. But it's been looked at. So macroeconomics is changing. As I said, there's a lot of work being done by people like Akerlof, and some of the work is quite interesting. Once you introduce the concept of norms, what people expect, it overturns a lot of the major axioms of macroeconomics. But it's going to take some time, and none of it has made its way into the macroeconomic textbooks yet. So just to conclude, I think as Thomas Kuhn, in his book The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, which is now in its 50th year and is the most cited social science book that's ever been written, as he says, it's via the textbooks that future generations of academics become inculcated about what are the legitimate ways to proceed, what are the important research questions, and what are paradigmatically correct analytical techniques. And I think it's quite clear that there's a need for another intellectual revolution in macroeconomics. So my final statement is from a quotation attributed to Keynes, which I think sums up the crisis quite neatly. Markets can remain irrational a lot longer than you and I can remain solvent. And just one last diagram, which is from Richard Haldane, an economist I have a great deal of respect, who I think is in charge of the Financial Regulation Division of the Bank of England. This just looks at the FTSE, the stock exchange, distribution of earnings, and it just shows you quite clearly what the black swans are, well outside the Gaussian distribution. And the subprime crisis is going to be amongst them. So thank you very much. I will conclude on that note.